There is an offer on your table. The buyer's agent calls the terms standard. Your agent says this is how it works. So you sign. 3 weeks later, the deal collapses. Or it closes, and you discover at the settlement table that you netted far less than you expected. Not because the price was wrong, because of what you agreed to inside the contract. I have watched sellers lose thousands of dollars in transactions that appeared perfectly clean. And in almost every case, the damage was done before the first showing ended. One agreement I will cover sounds so reasonable that even experienced sellers never push back on it. And the last one, the one I am saving for the end, is the agreement sellers regret most. Usually around the time they are starting the entire process over from scratch. Selling a home is the largest financial transaction most Americans will ever execute. Not the most frequent, the largest. And yet the average seller spends more time choosing paint colors than reviewing what they actually sign. The listing contract, the purchase agreement, the inspection response, the concession structure. Each of those is a legally binding decision with real financial consequences, made in most cases under time pressure, emotional stress, and incomplete information. What I want to talk about today is not the listing price or the staging or the photography. Those matter, but they are the parts sellers think about. What I want to talk about are the agreements, the things sellers say yes to, sometimes in writing, sometimes with a nod over the phone, that quietly transfer money, leverage, and control away from them. The things agents often describe as standard, without explaining what standard actually costs. Before I go through them, I want to say something directly. None of this is about protecting yourself from honest agents or reasonable buyers. Most agents are working hard for their clients. Most buyers are not trying to take advantage of anyone. What this is about is understanding what you are agreeing to before you agree to it. Because once it is signed, your options narrow dramatically, and renegotiating becomes a much harder conversation. The strongest leverage you have in a home sale is before the contract is signed. That is also the moment sellers are most anxious, most eager to move forward, and most likely to treat unfamiliar contract language as someone else's problem to worry about. Here are the agreements I would never advise a seller to accept without pushing back. Natsintroing use mines natsan craying, and in several cases without refusing outright. The first one is about access, not who buys your home, but who walks through it, when, and under what conditions. When a home goes on the market, the seller is essentially opening their property to strangers. That is unavoidable. But the specific terms of that access, how showings are scheduled, what accompaniment is required, whether buyers can roam unescorted, whether your agent or anyone else is present, those are agreements, and sellers frequently accept whatever the listing agent suggests without asking a single question. The mistake is agreeing to a lockbox and leave system without any guardrails. A standard electronic lockbox allows any licensed agent to schedule a showing and enter the property with their buyer. That is often appropriate, but it means you have no visibility into who entered the home, when, or whether anyone was actually qualified to buy it. Curious neighbors, casual browsers, and people with no financing whatsoever can walk through your home with nothing more than a licensed agent willing to show them. I understand why sellers accept this. It maximizes showing availability, and limiting access can slow down activity. But agreeing to completely unmonitored, unvetted access means the most important asset you own is accessible to anyone who calls a real estate office. What sellers should negotiate before the listing goes live is a showing protocol, not a barrier that prevents qualified buyers from getting in, but a reasonable structure. That can mean requiring appointment confirmation with a minimum lead time, requesting buyer financing pre-approval before private showings are scheduled on higher-priced properties, or simply ensuring the listing agent or a designated contact is reachable during any showing window. The goal is not suspicion, it is accountability. You are not running a public open house every day of the week. You are selling a home, and you have the right to know who is walking through it. A seller who sets reasonable access expectations is not being difficult. They are being responsible about the property they are still legally obligated to maintain. The second agreement that costs sellers significantly is one that happens before a single buyer arrives. It is the listing agreement itself, specifically what sellers agree to inside it, without realizing what they are committing to. Most sellers sign whatever their chosen agent presents. 6 months, full commission, exclusive right to sell. The agent explains that this is standard, which is true in the sense that it is what the template says. What it does not say is that this is negotiable, and most sellers never ask. A 6-month exclusive listing agreement means the agent has sole authority to sell your home for that duration. If the home sits for 4 months and you are dissatisfied with the marketing, the communication, or the showing volume, you may have no legal mechanism to change agents without exposing yourself to a commission dispute. Some agreements include automatic renewal clauses, which extend the relationship beyond the original term without a new conversation. And the language about what happens if the seller finds their own buyer independently through a neighbor, a relative, or a for-sale-by-owner inquiry is often written in favor of the brokerage, not the seller. I'm not saying agents are adversarial. I'm saying that sellers sign a binding legal contract and then trust that the relationship will work out. Before you sign any listing agreement, ask 3 direct questions. What is the shortest term you will accept? What does the cancellation process look like if I am not satisfied with performance? And what happens if I find my own buyer while this agreement is active? The answers to those 3 questions tell you more about what you are agreeing to than anything in the marketing presentation. In many markets, a 60 to 90-day initial listing term is reasonable. A performance clause that defines expected communication or marketing standards is reasonable. An early termination provision tied to clearly defined conditions is reasonable. Agents who refuse all of these entirely are not necessarily acting in bad faith, but they are asking you to commit without any protection for your position. A fair relationship does not require the seller to have no exit options at all. The third agreement that erodes seller proceeds is so common that most agents do not even flag it as a negotiation point. It is agreeing to pay the buyer's closing costs without adjusting the offer price to compensate. Here is how it typically happens. A buyer submits an offer and includes a request for the seller to contribute toward the buyer's closing costs, often framed in the offer as a seller credit or seller concession at closing. The buyer's agent may describe this as standard in the current market. Your agent may agree. And so the seller says yes because the gross sale price looks acceptable and the closing cost request does not feel like a price reduction. But it is. If a buyer offers a purchase price and requests that the seller cover several $1,000s of their closing costs, the seller is netting the purchase price minus the concession, minus the commission, minus their own closing costs. That concession is real money leaving the transaction. The gross number on the contract is not what the seller receives. I cannot stress this enough. Sellers who focus on the top line without calculating the net are making decisions based on incomplete arithmetic. There is a more important detail. In some loan types, there is a cap on how much of the closing costs a seller can actually contribute relative to the purchase price. If the seller agrees to a concession larger than the loan program allows, the unused portion simply disappears. The seller pays it, the buyer cannot use it, and the money is effectively gone from the transaction. When it is warranted is a fair question. In a buyer's market, where competing offers are scarce and the alternative is no offer at all, a closing cost concession may be what makes a deal happen. That is a legitimate strategic choice. In a seller's market with multiple competing offers, agreeing to a concession in the first counter is a negotiation error. The correction is not to refuse all concessions categorically. It is to counter by increasing the purchase price to offset the concession or to decline and explain the seller's net requirement clearly. The gross number and the net number are different. Sellers should always be working from the net. If you have found this useful and you are preparing to list or reviewing an offer right now, subscribe before you keep watching. What comes next is where the real money gets handed over, and it often happens before the seller realizes the decision has already been made. The fourth agreement, and this one tends to surprise sellers who thought they had done everything right, is agreeing to a price reduction too early in the listing period. A listing goes live. 2 or 3 weeks pass. Showings have occurred, but there are no offers. The agent calls and recommends dropping the price to generate fresh activity. The seller agrees because they want movement and because the agent says it is necessary. Here is what sellers should understand before making that call. The first 2 weeks of any listing carry the heaviest buyer attention by a significant margin. Pre-approved buyers with saved searches see new listings the same day they go live. They are comparing your home to everything else in the price range. And the initial launch window is when the most qualified buyers are paying the closest attention. After 4 to 6 weeks, that audience shifts. The serious buyers who were going to move on your home have moved. The audience that remains skews toward less qualified prospects and bargain hunters. A price reduction made at week 3 may generate a second wave of activity. And sometimes that is the right call. But agreeing to reduce without first demanding specific data is a mistake. How many showings occurred? What was the feedback from each showing? Not a vague summary, but what specific objections were raised? How does the showing volume compare to other active listings in the same price range over the same period? Was the listing fully marketed across all platforms, or was the agent relying on the MLS feed alone? These questions are not aggressive. They are the minimum due diligence a seller should perform before agreeing to lower the most important number in the transaction. If the answers are incomplete or the feedback consistently points to price, a reduction may be appropriate. But if showings were limited because the property was difficult to access, or if marketing was not fully deployed, or if a seasonal factor was suppressing all activity in the price range, then reducing the price is treating the wrong problem. It signals seller motivation to buyers who are already watching. And every buyer's agent who shows the reduced listing knows exactly what that signal means. The fifth agreement follows an accepted offer, and it is where a great many sellers believe the hard part is over. It is agreeing to inspection demands as written. An inspection contingency is standard and, in most transactions, appropriate. A buyer hires an inspector, the inspector produces a report, and the buyer submits a repair request or a request for a credit at closing. Sellers frequently treat this as a bill they are required to pay. It is not. It is an opening position in a negotiation. The inspector's job is to find and document every observable defect, concern, and maintenance item in the home. A thorough inspection report on any home more than 15 years old will contain multiple pages of findings. Some of those findings are structural or safety-related and genuinely material to the transaction. Others are deferred maintenance items, cosmetic conditions, or age-related wear that any buyer of a used home should expect to encounter. The buyer's request will typically not distinguish between those categories. It is the seller's responsibility to. Two errors are common. The first is agreeing to fix everything on the list to keep the deal alive. This is frequently more expensive than a targeted credit at closing would have been, and it creates additional risk, because work done under pressure by contractors hired quickly is not always done well, and the seller now has a potential liability problem if something goes wrong before the closing date. The second error is agreeing to a lump sum dollar credit without reviewing which items on the list actually justify it. A buyer who requests a large credit based on a long inspection report may be combining genuinely material concerns with items that a reasonable buyer should simply accept as part of purchasing a home that was built years or decades ago. Here is the leverage reality that sellers often do not appreciate at the inspection stage. Both parties are invested in closing. The seller may have already given notice on a new residence or started a separate purchase. The buyer has spent money on the inspection, spent time on the process, and may have made other plans around this transaction. Neither side actually wants to start over. Sellers who understand that dynamic respond to inspection demands from a position of clarity, not panic. Address the items that could affect financing, safety, or reasonable expectations. Decline or counter on cosmetic and maintenance items. The deal will usually hold. There is one more thing I want to clarify about as-is listings, because I hear this misconception regularly. Listing a home as-is does not mean the inspection contingency is waived. In most states, it means the seller has disclosed known conditions and does not intend to make repairs. Buyers can still conduct an inspection and still submit demands. As-is is a disclosure posture, not a shield against post-inspection negotiation. This is the point where I want to step back and say something about the pattern we are looking at. Every agreement I have described so far was offered to the seller as normal, as the way things work, as what the other side needs, as standard practice in the current market. Standard does not mean safe. Standard means it is in the contract template. Whether it is in the seller's interest is a separate question, and it is the question most sellers are never asked to consider. The listing process is designed to facilitate a transaction. That is its function. It is not designed specifically to protect the seller's net proceeds, the seller's timeline, or the seller's options. The seller who understands that distinction negotiates differently from one who assumes the process is neutral. Every agreement a seller makes is negotiable before it is signed. After it is signed, the options narrow quickly. And the other side knows exactly what those options are. The sixth agreement is one that became more visible during competitive market conditions and has remained in use as markets shifted. It is agreeing to cover an appraisal gap with no defined limit. When a buyer makes an offer, the lender will order an appraisal. If the appraised value comes in lower than the agreed purchase price, the buyer's lender will typically only finance the appraised amount. The gap between the contract price and the appraised value becomes the buyer's problem unless the seller has agreed otherwise. In softer markets, buyers sometimes ask the seller to accept the appraised value as the final sale price, regardless of what the contract says. That is an appraisal gap agreement, and without a defined cap, the seller has essentially agreed to let a third-party appraiser determine the final sale price of their home. Appraisals are professional opinions, not established facts. They rely on comparable sales, and comparable sales reflect past transactions, not current demand. A home in a micro-market with limited comparable data, or in a neighborhood where prices have moved recently, may appraise conservatively simply because the available comps are dated or insufficient. A seller who has agreed to match any appraisal result has transferred that risk entirely to themselves, with no ceiling on the exposure. The correct approach when a buyer requests an appraisal gap agreement is to negotiate a defined cap. A specific dollar amount above which the buyer, not the seller, is responsible for the difference. If the buyer will not accept any cap whatsoever, the seller needs to understand what they are actually agreeing to before signing. Open-ended exposure to an appraisal result is not a small risk. It is a check written to an unknown recipient for an unknown amount. The last agreement is the one sellers regret most. I have watched it play out more than once, and the sequence is always the same. A seller accepts an offer, the home goes under contract, weeks pass, and then the whole thing falls apart. Not because of the inspection, not because of the appraisal, but because the buyer's own home never sold. This is the home sale contingency. It means the buyer's purchase of your home depends on the buyer first successfully closing on the sale of their own property. This is not an unreasonable situation. A large share of American home buyers are simultaneous sellers, and they genuinely need the equity from their current home to fund the next purchase. The contingency itself is not the problem. The problem is accepting it without a kick-out clause. Here is what happens without one. Your home goes under contract and shows as pending on the MLS. Other buyers and buyer's agents who were considering your home now see it as unavailable and move on. Meanwhile, the buyer's home sits on the market. It may be overpriced. It may be in a slower area. It may not sell for weeks or longer. During that time, you cannot accept another offer without a formal process, and in most cases, you cannot effectively market the home to backup buyers without undermining the existing contract. You are locked, your home is off the market for a deal that may never close. A kick-out clause changes the structure entirely. It allows you, as the seller, to continue marketing the home. If a second qualified offer arrives, you notify the first buyer that they have a defined window, typically 24 to 72 hours, though this varies by contract and by state, to remove their home sale contingency and proceed. If they can remove it, the original deal continues. If they cannot, you are free to accept the new offer. Your home never truly goes dark. Your options stay open. Without that clause, the seller has agreed to put their property and their timeline in the hands of a buyer's real estate market, one they have no visibility into and no control over. If the buyer's home sits for 6 weeks and then falls apart, your listing returns to active with accumulated days on market, a completed pending period that attentive buyers will notice, and whatever impression that sequence leaves on the next group of prospects. A home that goes pending and returns to active carries a perception problem that even strong marketing cannot fully erase. The practical rule is not complicated. Never accept a home sale contingency without a kick-out clause. If the buyer's agent tells you the buyer will not accept that term, ask a straightforward question. What is the buyer afraid of? A buyer who is confident that their home will sell promptly has no rational objection to a clause that only triggers if a better offer arrives. Resistance to the kick-out is information about how confident that buyer actually is. A seller does not lose a negotiation all at once. They lose it one reasonable-sounding agreement at a time. The access terms, the listing contract, the concession, the early price reduction, the inspection response, the appraisal exposure, the contingency structure, each one, in isolation, can seem manageable or even trivial. The cumulative effect is a closing statement that looks substantially different from the number the seller thought they were getting when that first offer landed. The principle underneath all of this is not complicated. The seller's job is not to make every party in the transaction feel comfortable. The seller's job is to protect their net proceeds, their timeline, and their options. Flexibility that costs money without improving the outcome is not a negotiating virtue, and knowing what you are agreeing to before you agree to it is not being difficult. Ismasakats nasating masapim nasnatiens maker nasatur it is being prepared. Think back to where we started, an offer on the table, both agents calling it standard, the seller signing because that is what you do when the moment arrives. The number in the contract looking right, even as several quieter agreements inside it were already changing what the seller would actually receive. Standard means it is in the template. It does not mean it serves your interests. The sellers who close with the strongest outcomes are not the toughest people in the room. They are the ones who understood which things were worth pushing back on and why. They read what they signed, they asked the questions their agents did not volunteer, they knew the difference between gross and net. They treated that pen as what it actually is. Sakın san. The most consequential instrument in the entire transaction. If you are getting ready to list your home, or you are already sitting across from an offer right now, tell me in the comments, what did your agent describe as standard that did not sit right when you thought about it afterward? I read them all, and the answers usually become the next video.